book of Esther deals with those who are still in Babylon. Uh, that that same time frame of the return of Ezra and Nehemiah and so forth. So you got that kind of a close time frame, likely why it follows Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. We took time to talk about the providence of God and the significance of the providence of God that's throughout the book, and especially in the opening couple of chapters. We talked at length about Esther coming to the throne, putting her in that place of being the queen and making that a very significant move by God Himself to put a Jewish at that particular place at that particular time because of what is about to come. So the things worked out so that Esther was chosen to be the queen. And then you have Mordecai, her cousin, that was the one who had really adopted her because she had no parents, and so Mordecai, her cousin, becomes her guardian, becomes like a father and daughter relationship, and Mordecai cares for her. One of the things that kind of jumps out too is that Mordecai has a great care for his people. So he has this very caring and very loving, obviously, personality. So he seems to have been in a good place with Esther as he loves her and as he cares for her. And you remember while she was in the preparation process to be ready to be chosen by the king, Mordecai would check on her every day, and as his care and concern for Esther was. So we talked about that providence of God throughout that process of Esther being chosen as queen, and so that puts her there on the throne, that Persian throne, as this trouble begins. And that trouble is that Haman, who is a descendant of Agag, it calls him an Agagite. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But Haman makes a plea to the king that there's this group of people that are the Jews that are not behaving. They're not going to do right. They're not going to follow the laws. They're not going to do the things that they're supposed to do. So after Haman makes his declaration, that's chapter 3, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Medatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. So Haman is really angry. Haman is really beside himself because Mordecai will not do as he's supposed to do. So there's this plot by Haman then to make the situation so that the Jews will be destroyed. And so the king makes this decree that all of the Jews will be annihilated on this certain day, certain month, certain time, that all of the Jews will be killed. And so that's the difficulty. That's kind of where we were when we had to end class last week, as we think about Haman, who hated the Jews. He hated Mordecai, and Mordecai hears about the decree, and he makes contact with Esther. Ryan reminded me after class last week about the significance of Haman being an Agagite, or a descendant of Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites, long time enemies of the Jewish people. And God had told King Saul to destroy the Amalekites many centuries earlier, 1 Samuel chapter 15. But Saul didn't obey that command, and because of his disobedience, not only did Saul lose the kingdom, but ultimately here you have the situation now where the Jews are in the situation to be annihilated. They're in the position where they can be totally taken out by this descendant of King Agag or the Amalekites in Esther's time. And so there's this threat by Haman to take the Jews out, to really take them all the way out. Any other comments about that? I didn't take a lot of time to describe that. Ryan, you want to add something to that? Did I get that right, or I totally messed it up? But King Agag of the Amalekites was allowed to live, and as a result of that, the struggle continued. All right, anything concerning the background up to this time where Mordecai begins to inform Esther about this plan and what's about to take place? Anything? Okay, sure.
I read this last week, but I didn't see anything. But I read in one place that Mordecai was her uncle. Then I also read he was her cousin.
Yeah, I actually made a statement that he was the uncle, maybe what I read, but actually he is her cousin. Her mother was Esther's. He was Esther's uncle. He was Esther's mother's uncle.
I was just reading here on Google, Queen Esther is an orphan raised by her uncle Mordecai and is eventually married to King.
Yeah. Well, after that was brought up last week, I looked back and what I wrote here beside it was Abihail was the uncle of Mordecai, which would make them cousins. So that seems to be the way it shakes out. Okay. Good question, though. Obviously, I was confused because when we started, I called him her uncle, too. Okay, let's go to chapter 4. We've kind of made our way there and referred to this, I think, maybe a little bit as we talked about Mordecai bringing this to Esther's attention, bringing that decree to the attention of Esther. Look at chapter 4, verse 1, beginning. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping, lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So the mourning and all of the things that go on with the mourning, the sackcloth, the ashes, the crying, the weeping, the whole thing that's going on here with Mordecai, going on with all of those Jews across the land because of the decree and because of the prospects of this decree. And notice when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, and he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what it was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued to in Susa for the destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of the people. So Mordecai sends the message back to Esther through her eunuch, which also includes a copy of the decree. And he says, you've got to do something about this. This is something that threatens the existence of our people. So when Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded, and when he came back, Verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So Esther explains, here's why I can't go to the king. Because if I go without being invited, and I haven't been invited, if I go without being invited, then the king can order me to be killed. It's kind of automatic. There seems to be no bartering and no juggling and nothing that can happen. And if you do that, and the king says it's over, it's over. There's no. That's the law, and Esther says everybody knows this law. You do not go into the presence of the king without being invited.
So they get tested for it.
Oh yeah. They thought themselves to be very highly of themselves for sure. Yeah. And you can imagine there are a lot of stories about kings who went out among the crowds over the history of the many kingdoms. The king that might go out into the crowds. And most of the time it didn't turn out very well. So you didn't want to just let anybody in any time of day, and because you never knew who had a sword hidden, right? I mean, we have some Old Testament stories about kings who were killed by daggers. So maybe there was a lot of reason behind that. If my predecessor is killed by somebody that comes in without me inviting them, then maybe I'm not going to invite anybody.
Well, I'm sure you have plenty of guards around.
Yeah, true.
And you think the queen could.
Yeah, and she does. So we're yeah. She was one of his favorites. So all of this is communicated to Esther. Mordecai tells her what's going on. There's a copy of the decree, and he tells her how she can take care of this, and that is, you need to go make a plea to the king. Her response, can't do it. I can't because I haven't been invited to come before the king. Verse 12. No, see, I just read 12. Verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Now, here's the crux of the book of Esther, and this is what we remember mostly, and this is a section that we sometimes refer to, and there have been a lot of things taught about this very section, because here is Mordecai's response to Esther when Esther says, I can't do it. Here's what Mordecai says. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai's plea is, now here's a sign of Mordecai's faith, because he really says that deliverance is going to come from somewhere. God's people are going to be delivered somehow, somewhere. Somebody's going to rise up. God's people are going to be delivered somehow. So that tells me a lot about Mordecai's faith and his understanding of how God has been with the people throughout all of these generations. And then he says, so if you don't do it, you're likely going to die anyway, you and your father's house. So either you go and risk being killed, or you don't go, everything follows through on this, and you're going to be killed when they find out you're a Jew anyway. You and your father's house will perish.
So does that mean the king couldn't change his decree or tweak it to where she wouldn't get killed? I didn't know if a decree from the king.
Yeah, a decree made like that is supposedly unchangeable, but I don't think there's anything that they wouldn't change if it was in the best interest of the king. I think I think kings will go back on their word in a heartbeat if it's to their best interest. Now, could he say, well, I'm not going to kill Esther? He could, but I think Esther being a Jew would probably put him into that point where he would have to follow through and kill
Well, all
her.
he had to do is hold out his phone secretary, because anybody, like I said, if you're not invited and you come in, and he doesn't hold out the scepter.
Yes.
So he had a way to take care of it.
Yeah, yeah. Now, are you talking about when they actually follow through on the decree, or are you talking about when she comes to see him?
No.
When she comes to see him, as Randy points out, anybody that came in to see the king without an appointment, if he held out his scepter, then you can come on in, you're okay. Yeah, I thought that's what you're talking about. Yeah, so when he's following through on the decree, what Mordecai says is, he's going to kill you and he's going to kill you in your house. Now, could he change it? Maybe, but he wouldn't be saving face by doing that. That was a big deal. They'll mention something about their big ego. They wanted to save face at every turn. And he probably would have felt a little bit betrayed to find out she was a Jew as well.
He couldn't change the law. He just
He just created new, yeah. But much like politicians do today, we don't change that one, we just create more. All right, good questions. Okay, so there's that statement that sometimes we focus on when he says, well, who knows whether that you might have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So that's something that we use a lot, and this is the context of it, where Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to follow through on what he believes is the best plan, and that is for you to go to the king and make this plea to the king. So notice verse 15 beginning. So Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, and this is where she says, gather all of the Jews in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and my young women, and I will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So Esther says, we're going to fast and pray about this. You get all the Jews in Susa to fast and pray about this 3 days, night and day, and at the end of that time, then I will go to the king. A time of preparation. I've never heard the sermon, but Randy just preached. The two preparations of Esther. There was this time of preparation for this year where she's being prepped for the meeting of the king with all of the cosmetics and all of the food and everything that goes along with it. So she'll be beautiful and be presented to the king. So there's this time of preparation. And then here's another time of preparation. I'm about to be presented to the king again. Well, I need things to be right, and it has nothing to do with my beauty. It has everything to do with the blessing of my God. So the reason I pointed out to Randy was talking about a sermon after last Wednesday night about preparation and ready to meet the king, that kind of thing. All right, so you've got that. She takes this time as preparation for meeting the king. And so after that, you find the courage of Esther, and that's in chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Somebody wants to read that for me? I've been doing a lot of reading, but you want to read that for me? 5, 1 through 8.
Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house. While the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house, so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther had said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Of to have the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said."
Okay, very good. So the courage of Esther now is demonstrated in those first couple of verses of chapter 5, where she presents herself before the king. Now, this is what she was concerned about. Remember when Mordecai sent word to her and told her of the plan that Haman had in place and they had gotten the king to agree to, and there's this decree that all of the Jews will be killed on this particular day. And so she says, the reason I can't go is because I have not been invited before the king. And so the next thing that happens is Mordecai convinces her this is the right thing to do. So there is this fasting and prayer that takes place, not only with Esther and her party, but with the Jews in Susa. And then following that, on that third day, chapter 5, verse 1, she dressed herself, she went before the king, he invited her in, and not only invited her in, but offered her anything that she wanted up to half of her kingdom. That was pretty strong right there, wasn't it? Now, what does that tell you about how King Xerxes felt about Esther?
He was taken with her more than any other person.
It seems that way, doesn't it?
I mean, you think about it. Now, he has made that, and he said it twice.
Yes.
I'll give you up to half the kingdom. That means at that point that you would have as much power as I do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's saying something.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
That's trusting.
Yes, I think so. I think she demonstrated to him that she could be trusted. She was evidently a very good woman, and from that perspective, the way the king's treated her.
He truly loved her.
Because he wouldn't have offered that to somebody that he didn't trust.
Then again, you have to remember, God's in charge too.
Yes.
So God's also giving him the response.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that I pointed out in the beginning. One thing that never says it in here, but one thing you can't miss is the providence of God and how all of this works out. And Randy points out that you've got to remember that God's still in control of this, and for him to make this statement is just kind of preparatory. In when she finally asks, then it's not going to sting quite so badly, I guess, because he's already offered her half the kingdom. So if I can get by with giving her less than the kingdom, something that simple, it seems less dramatic in kind of a way.
Well, Mordecai even said it. He said, "Who knows that you may have been put
Exactly. Yes.
in this position for this time, just like Joseph was put in that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about that I think last week.
We did. Yes. Yeah.
It just follows God's plan.
It sure does. And to me, and I think we did talk about Joseph, and Joseph ultimately being second in command in Egypt. And here you've got a Jew, Queen Esther, who's basically, from the way he feels about her, she's got a lot of power and a lot of pull here. And because of Joseph and because of Esther, the nation of God survives. You just can't miss that. I mean, it's just so obvious how God continues to intervene, and his work continues, and his nation, his people continue. John, what is it that when you read the book of Esther and they read the name Haman, what do the Jews say? Boo, boo. Yeah.
No, they do. This is part of their program. This is part of the feast that they every March is that they play games and they read this book, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, they boo.
Yeah. Well, I wish that Saul had. Well, never mind. If Saul had recognized what the situation was, maybe.
Mordecai puts his trust in God, although God is never mentioned in this book.
Right.
The word God is never mentioned, but it's there. It's there in his spirit. It's there in his actions. It's there in his word.
Yeah.
So it's there, but it's not ever mentioned. God is never mentioned in that book.
It's inferred a lot, and that's one of the reasons I began by talking about God's providence being present here. And as has already been referred to, when Mordecai mentions it to Esther, who knows that you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this, that also infers the fact that God has put her where she is for this time. All right, let's continue. What happens next in chapter 5, verse 9 beginning, is that Haman has a plan to hang Mordecai. Now, it's not going to be enough to kill all the Jews, but because Mordecai wouldn't bow to him, as he'd gotten the king to tell everybody to do, bow to me, Haman says, Haman is going to take revenge. So notice chapter 5, verse 9. Haman went out on that day joyful and glad of heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, bless her heart, living with Haman. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of all his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast you prepared, and tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows built. There's some rage being acted out by a man of great power, isn't it? So he has this great power, and his friends tell him, here's how you're going to solve that. You have this wrath against Mordecai. He doesn't want to bow down and worship you. He didn't want to show honor to you. And so he lists all of the reasons he ought to be honored there. And so you ought to just hang him. Hang him on the gallows. Just get rid of him. I don't know, but it's a match made somewhere. Chapter 6. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or dishonor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, Haman thinks he's talking about himself. Haman, I've just come in. King asked, what do you think we ought to do to somebody that the king wants to honor? So Haman, probably his ego and his head swelling really big right now. Well, Haman's response is, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him to the house on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Hurry, take the robes, the horse, as you said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Wow.
I got trouble right here in River City.
To Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning, with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. That's the end of chapter 6. So what we're going to have now as we begin chapter 7 is this. We had in chapter 6 this misunderstanding by Haman. He's thinking that he's going to be the one rewarded, but actually the king needs to reward Mordecai. So here's the first little hiccup in Haman's plan. I've got all this power, I've got all this importance, and yet I'm not surely going to be able to follow through.
I've got a question, because it's kind of interesting to me, this fact of what they just said to Haman, that his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, you won't prevail, but you will surely fall before him. What made them think that? What made them all of a sudden think, well, wow, this guy's a Jew, and you can't beat those guys. I mean, but they're over here having gotten their,
the day before they've said, kill him, hang him.
Yeah, but the thing is, they were in exile. I mean, they were over here in a foreign country, taking, their city had been destroyed. I mean, so what made them think they couldn't be defeated? Yeah.
That's a great question, Randy, because just the day before, they're telling him, go out there and kill Haman, kill Mordecai, build a gallows. So he builds a gallows, he's ready to hang. Mordecai actually went to the king to get that written by the king, and the tables turned.
Yeah.
So what exactly caused his wife and his friends to change their tune so dramatically is Randy's question. I'll say it right up front, I don't know what happened. Except you have maybe this understanding that, hey, we had this really good plan and it didn't work for some reason.
Well, I think one of the things that probably stands out is that these Jewish people are different than everybody else.
Yes.
I mean, all these other people are idolaters. The Jewish people are the only people, they're the only religion that had a moral law. Mm-hmm. None of these other religions had a moral law. I mean, the Jews did, and they were a better people, even though, there's a lot of people that didn't do right, but they still, overall, they were different from everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, generally speaking, as a rule, they would have been influential even in captivity.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Daniel, and I mean, you see, how
so many of them. Ezra and Nehemiah, the only reason they were allowed to go back is because of the reputation they had with the king.
Yeah.
Anybody got an answer? I don't have.
Any good politician, and he's going to change his tune to keep his, keep his position.
Okay.
He's going to not going to, well, hold on a second. We need to change what we thought to begin with.
Yeah.
So like any good politician, he's going to go with the flow.
Well, that's true, but right now he is so overwhelmed with this wrath and anger. I'm shocked that he would take advice. Yes.
Mordecai knew where Amalekites, they've been around the Jews for centuries. And I'm sure when this happened, they're like, oh no, we've seen this before. Here we go again.
Oh, you mean Haman and his friend? Yes, Haman. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. That may be the answer that we're looking for, is that the ancestors of Haman, being the Amalekites, have seen this before. People ready to wipe out the Jews when something happens. Good observation.
It's like the Amalekite, an Amalekite that Saul did not, because he didn't annihilate them all. That was the one, that Amalekite's the one that slew Saul. He's the one that came to David with all the, Saul's crown and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Saul said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Amalekite." And this is what happened. I slew him. Of course, he said, "I didn't think he could live after he fell on his spear." But, and then there's some other things the Amalekites did that, so they've got a history. I had another thought about it. I kind of forgot it. I'm an old guy.
That's all right. That's all right.
Yeah, it's only 5 hours.
It's only 5 after 7. I got 40 more minutes. Okay, so to skip ahead, we're in chapter 7. The future depends upon Esther. And so in chapter 7, verse 3, pick up in verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor," this is at the feast. "If I found favor in your eyes," I lost my, okay. "What is your wish?" he says. Okay, "if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went to the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the palace where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch before where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was abated. So there's the end of of Haman. There's the end. He is caught in this trap that Esther lays for him, and Esther calls him to this second feast, and he thinks he's being wined and dined because he's so mighty important. And the table turns quickly when the king says, "Esther, here we are at the second feast. I've told you that anything that you ask for, up to half my kingdom is yours. What is it you request?" And she said, "There is an evil man who has put into practice, to process the annihilation of my people." "Who is that?" he asked. "Haman." And she has a few choice words for him. Do you notice those? So, boy, I think that if you're preaching somebody's funeral, you leave out all those words. And it is his funeral. Matter of fact, it's being preached before he dies. King walks back in, and it's not a pretty picture. He's laying at the feet of Queen Esther, begging for his life, and King comes in, "You're going to assault my queen right in front of my eyes, and let's kill him." And so they hang him on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai. Hang your enemies. Well, it got rid of his wrath for sure. we're not talking about God's people here. We're not talking about God. He's not a God person. He's not following the old law or the new law or any kind of law. It's the law of the king. So, yeah, we can't